You're not mentioned then he has a small something that they used to call the mail, now it's capture. And now the converted, which is
It's an interesting thing because there are sections like there are sections that
your mother, you're the mother, are you?
I'm very well related.
I was going to say
I'd say
that get rid of the children. Their Hollander is totally different.
That's like when I
didn't want to be too
That's like when I was first engaged and my sister-in-law had a party for us.
You know,
I don't know anyone there. So I'm talking to this man. He's a nice guy. So have you known the family? Have you known the family long? He said, well, actually, I'm your future wife's uncle.
Oh. It's funny how he's done very well. He's done it on his own partnership. Oh, yeah.
Mike.
Yeah, we live not too far from the Olympic Village. Well, we're actually in between, and now it's the Valley of
Yes. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out for this. It's really a treat to have Mike. And just a reminder, Mike's going to do another session. Is it Wednesday, Mike? Wednesday, right? Wednesday at noon here at the synagogue.
Running for mayor of, I can't.
You can't. Wednesday here at noon on what tourists see and don't see when they go to Israel. That's a bring your own lunch, and weather permitting, we'll do it again in the tent, or we'll go inside if it's super cold or something. Hopefully this is comfortable enough. We are recording this session, so if you miss it, or you want to go back to it, or you want to send it to all of your friends of Mike's mom is here. You can send the link out. It's on our YouTube page. So without any further introduction, and this will go for about 45 minutes to an hour, we'll see, Mike Hollander.
Thank you, Rabbi. Again, I'm not going to apologize for my accent.
Oh,
can you all see the screen? You guys might want to move over there because everyone can see the screen. At that table, I would suggest moving maybe over there because I don't want to disturb you. Tell me down if everybody can see.
Yeah, we're good.
Move over more. No, but that table over there can't. Good. So welcome. As I mentioned, for those of you already in services, you're probably wondering why we're having so many elections. That's a very good question. But a theory I've developed is that there's a conspiracy. We're living in this age of false truths and multiple narratives and conspiracy theories. I'm convinced that the Israeli paper producers or the marketing companies just keep on to get more and more business. Because somebody actually makes money out of Israeli elections. What I want to try to do is do a crash course in Israeli politics, how our system works. I know a number of you. How many of you have lived in Israel before? How many of you voted in Israel before? Well, you know, Tamara and Lucy, you know that we have this idea in Israel that you vote early and you vote often, kind of like Chicago, but different. We have now, we're almost 75 years old, and we're going to be having our 26th election, if I'm not mistaken, which isn't bad. It's every 3 years, given that we're supposed to have it every 4 years. I mentioned inside our parsha, we talk about shoftim, judges, and in many ways, a challenge in the 75 years of Israeli, almost 75 years of Israeli history is how do we transition from what is called a rabbanut, so leadership led by rabbis, to ribonut, sovereignty. How a powerless people became a powerful people over a few thousand years. In order to do that, I want to kind of take a step back. Many of you know that most of my livelihood has been taking tours around Israel. And this is a plug for my Wednesday session, Lunch and Learn, about what people see in Israel versus what really happens in Israel. But one of the biggest questions I get from people is, why is your governing system so I can use the word in Yiddish, I guess most of you speak it, verkackt, which is loosely translated as crazy. We always seem to be surviving. There's a fragile coalition. We're always on the brink of heading to new elections. Everything always seems to be like a balagan. And the short answer is that our system is different. In order to understand our system, I encourage you, and as I did a few years ago when I passed the age of 50, that's a call out to my mom, anyway, but when I turned 50, I had to get new lenses in my glasses to see, like transitional lenses. So I'm going to tell all of you, although most of you I think already have the lenses that you've had for a long time, to take your lenses off and to go on this transition over what we read today until where we are today, right? Just a brief, al-regel achad, 1 foot, to remind us how we got here. God took us out of slavery. He commanded us in the desert to be holy people. We then come into the land of Israel. We then, as we discovered in the Parsha today, eventually rose up and asked for a king. We got our first king, King Saul. Our third king builds a temple in Jerusalem. We talked in the Parsha again about the priests, about the Levites. The temple was destroyed, and the second temple was rebuilt, and the second temple was destroyed. And then, post-destruction of the temple, we created a whole new form of Judaism, which revolved around rabbis, leaders, people who were ordained teachers of the law. And for 2,000 years, our centers of community physically were synagogues, our leaders were rabbis, and all of a sudden, exactly this week, 125 years ago, the idea of Zionism was established, in political Zionism, I should say, by Theodor Herzl in Basel, Switzerland, where he writes, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state. I can't say this out loud because if I do, people will laugh at me, but within 5 years, surely no more than 50 years, we will have a Jewish state." And he was right, because by 1947, the United Nations recommended partitioning Palestine to create a Jewish state. So we find ourselves now in a situation where we don't just read the Torah portion every few weeks before the high holidays about how we should govern ourselves, but rather we have an opportunity in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel, to actually govern ourselves. Here's some pictures. I put this when I was coming here, and I reached out to Rabbi Dan, and I said, well, how about something elections? And I said, I actually have something just up my sleeve. One of the good things, I will say a few good things about COVID, is I actually learned how to make presentations. Some of you, I know, attended and participated in my series on the history of Zionism in Israel, but this is the last picture I had with members of a legislature, the Massachusetts legislature, years and years ago, just before COVID. So what happened? Zionism starts in Basel, 1897. People, like some of you around here, your parents and grandparents, start to contribute money to buy land in the land of Israel. And Jews, even though Jews had already started to come back in the 1880s to the land of Israel, things begin to kind of coalesce into a state before there actually is a state, until the 14th of May, 1948. Some of you, I won't embarrass anybody, but there was no TV back then for those of you who watched this. Anyway, even if you were around in 1948. But Ben-Gurion, as you know, declares Israeli independence. We're all happy and we're all excited. And that moment is a moment that connects between what we read in Torah and what I'm talking about today. That transition from Rabbanut to Ribonut. And it isn't, what's happened? There we go in this video. Sorry, it hasn't yet been resolved. Oh, by the way, some of you, I realize, we're not there. Make this play. Okay, there's another line. That's why. Sorry. So Ben-Gurion signs, Golda signs. I don't know how many of you remember. Did Ben-Gurion ever visit Vancouver? I remember Golda in the 1970s came. I was a young student at Talmud Torah, and if I was wise enough back then when I was 8, I was wise, but not that type of wise. It was a different wise, but my teachers remind me of that. But if I was wise enough back then, I would have maybe asked Golda, say, Mrs. Meyer, how does it feel to be one of those important people sitting around the table deciding to declare independence, to transition our people from 2,000 years of Rabbanut, of being led by rabbis, to Ribonut? I never quite got to that point. But unfortunately, there aren't too many people left who signed that Declaration of Independence. But that was a very, very important moment. How do we get from 1897 to today? There is Herzl, the famous Three Kings hotel balcony, that if you read any Jewish newspapers online, you might have seen the president of Israel standing there, Chaim Herzog. You remember him? His father, Bougie Herzog, his father, Chaim Herzog, did something similar when he was president years ago. How do we get there? And if you look at the Israeli election, or you look at the Israeli political system, in many ways, I think it's important to understand that the way the system works today is largely a function of what happened in 1897. A Zionist movement was created, the World Zionist Organization was formed, and you had a series of political, I guess we're amongst family, right, Dan? I can say this here, that you all agree on everything, right? Even if you're members of the same synagogue, there are never any disagreements, correct? Good. So Jews, always agree on everything. So we had lots of ideological parties, from Mizrahi to the ultra-Orthodox to socialist, and then Marxist, which are fundamentally different than socialist, to the Bund, who were different than Marxist. It's typically Jewish. But we had a series of parties that ultimately formed into a provisional state council before independence. There were 13 members from 7 different political parties. I remind you, our current government, has 8 political parties, even more diverse than these 7 parties. But don't be surprised by what you saw in the past year by an Israeli unprecedented coalition government, because we've been there before for most of the history of Zionism. We had a provisional government. They served until our first elections in January of 1949. And in those elections, Ben-Gurion, our founding prime minister, got barely a third of the popular vote. They decided 120 members should sit in the Knesset, in the parliament. But of course, if you've only got 46 of 120 seats in parliament, you know this from your Canadian system, you can't quite govern. You need to have the minimum threshold of at least 61 seats. And so already from the get-go, there was a coalition. We'll come back to that because we've had many, many more of those. But I think in the context of Israel succeeding to create a democracy, try to realize where we're coming from. We're coming from a powerless people exiled to 4 corners of the earth from 70 different countries. The vast majority of them are immigrants who came from countries where there was no democratic tradition. Most of us, I'm looking around, probably are Ashkenazim from Eastern or Central Europe. And by our 10th birthday, the population trebled. 500,000 Jews coming in from Europe, many Holocaust survivors, 750,000 Jews coming in from Islamic countries in the Middle East. None of these countries had, we're not talking Central and Western Europe, we're talking Eastern Europe. None of them came from democratic systems, number one. Number two, the founding fathers and mothers decided to create a Jewish and democratic state. And you're probably aware of the fact that a little over 4 years ago, the Knesset passed a new law called the Jewish Nation State Law, which essentially said, we can no longer live in this tension, Jewish and democratic. We're going to prioritize the Jewish nature character of the state over the democratic character of nature. But that's a tension that we lived with for 72 years. We still have it there. And as I said, I think that when you look at a country like America, maybe less so Canada, but most Western democracies, the founding fathers and mothers came from a relatively democratic tradition. That for the Americans in the crowd, realizing that when America was founded, it was, all men are created free and equal. That was if you were a man, and if you were a Protestant and not a Catholic, and if you're white, then not a person of color and not a woman. So given the fact that our democracy is one of the youngest Western democracies with some of the greatest challenges because of the makeup of the first immigrants, it's pretty impressive. How does it actually work? We have one parliament, kind of like Canada, no bicameral, not like the American system. We have 120 members of a Knesset. We've had now 14 prime ministers as of today. There you go. We just had one recently. Our current prime minister is new. We've had 24 elections. We're heading to our 25th, and 36 governments. Why the difference? You're familiar in the Canadian system. You don't have this in America. You've got a president, and then you got the government for 4 years, and unless something happens, and even if it does happen, even there's impeachment, let's say in the American system, the president continues to be president, by and large. You might have ministers or cabinet secretaries who change, but in Israel, we oftentimes will change governments even after elections, without going to new election, by forming new coalitions. So it's confusing. Our first election, surprising to many, was an almost 87% voter turnout. It's January 49. There are some countries, by the way, not Canada, Australia, where you have to vote, right? There are not many like that, but Israel, right, option to vote, massive numbers of people voting, which is, again, crazy given where people were coming from. And the elections, as I mentioned, Ben-Gurion's party, there were lots of different parties. There was even an Arab Labor Party affiliated with Ben-Gurion's party. And Ben-Gurion, our founding father, created a government made up of, look at the diversity of his government. United Religious Front, so let's say a national religious party of later days, a progressive party, to the left probably of Ben-Gurion, a Sephardic Oriental party, a Democratic list, the Arab Party. You can see that people lining up to vote in Nazareth. A very diverse coalition that ultimately ensured that he was able to govern. Keep in mind, Ben Gurion received less than 50%, less than 35% of the popular vote. Not huge. But you're familiar, right, with the Canadian system. We sometimes, well, you have prime ministers who receive how much of the popular vote? It's a trick question. 0% of the popular vote, because your prime ministers aren't elected by direct vote, right? Nor our prime ministers, but that's another story. Anyway, the first Knesset was not in Jerusalem, it was in Tel Aviv, January 1949. There's still a war going on. Israel hasn't signed armistice. The building isn't there anymore. It was at a theater in Tel Aviv. The Knesset then moves to its first permanent residence. You see President Chaim Weizmann speaking there in the Knesset at a place in Tel Aviv called the Frumkin House, or the Fruman House, I should say. It is on the corner, it's on King George in the corner at the top of Bezalel Street. And today it is being transitioned into a museum of the Knesset. The Knesset that we are all familiar with only opens in 1966 on Givat Ram. And it's at this point, I tell you, you need to take your glasses off, because we're outside, but put on a different set of lenses in order to understand our system, fundamentally different than yours and most other political systems. So, many countries have presidential systems. You guys do not, right? Ours is similar to yours, or the British system, or the Australian system, except there's one big difference between our system and all those others. What's the big difference?
The list that you vote for.
So it's all proportional, but here you vote for I'm guessing on the ballot, I don't remember. In Vancouver, you vote for the mayor and then you vote for city council, correct? Which are the same in Israel, by the way. In Israeli elections, you vote for a party list, which is a national constituency. There are no ridings, there are no constituencies except one. Only 5 countries in the world have that unique, blessed, or cursed position, but that's what you have. There is no winner-take-all system. Many presidential systems, personally I think, are flawed in that they have a winner-take-all. You might win by more votes than the other person, or you might not, actually. You might have fewer votes than the other person, at least in the American system, but you're still president. Here, you have, Ben Gurion, 35% of the popular vote in 1949. And we have a prime minister now who is a party of 17 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. So even if you don't win, you still have some representation in the parliament, and you might even have some representation and a voice in the government. There is no constitution. You have a constitution, that is Canada, from when? I love Canadians. They're so proud of their country. 1982, if I'm not mistaken. Charlottetown, if I'm not mistaken. America's had a constitution for a while. England, when's their constitution from? It's a trick question, the Magna Carta, but there is no real constitution. We have instead basic laws, which are constitutional in nature, but they're not actually a constitution. The founding fathers and mothers wanted to create a constitution which would have been, the introduction would have been the Declaration of Independence, and then add chapters to it. But we're not quite there yet. There's no fixed election date, kind of like most democracies except America, except it is a vacation day, which means November 1st this year. It is a holiday. People aren't at work. Schools are closed. Most of the polling stations actually take place in schools. Who funds elections? I'm guessing similar to Canada, there's not a lot of PACs and super PACs and Uber, super duper PACs and whatever else. Very limited individual contributions are allowed, but the government pays for the elections, which includes budgets for printing materials, budgets for airtime on radio and television and internet, which is kind of crazy. So I say, it's crazy that we're having 5 elections in 3.5 years on the one hand. On the other hand, it's giving a lot of work to the people in the PR business and in radio and everything else. There are no absentee early ballots or mail-in ballots. You have to be in your polling station on the day of polling, unless you are one of 4 groups. A soldier, or you vote on your base or in the field, unless you are a diplomat, or unless you are a prisoner. Believe it or not, even the murderer of Yitzhak Rabin has the right to vote in Israel. Right, wrong, different. High voter turnout, very high. We're still at about 70% in elections, which is a very misleading statistic, because everybody who is around this table who is Israeli has the right to vote, as long as you get your little card in the mail. So we had elections, I can't remember the last elections we had, let's say, we had 7 ballots that were sent to our house. We're a family of 5. I have a cousin in Australia who lived in Israel for a few years. He has our mailing address. Good friends who are in England who lived in Israel for many years. We are his mailing address. So you'll see more about how we do that. So it's a misleading statistic. It's the people who are actually in the voting roll on the Ministry of Interior population registry, not people living in Israel at any moment in time. We've, as I mentioned already before, always have coalition governments. We have a head of government, the prime minister, and a head of the state, kind of like your very powerful but important governor general, who accepts diplomatic protocol, who accepts the governor general. So very similar in that sense. Head of state, he or she, so far it's only he, has a responsibility to meet the members, the leaders of each of the parties who pass the minimum threshold and get elected into the Knesset, and try to figure out which of those party leaders is most eligible to form a government. That's about it. And finally, the question I will leave you with, without definitively answering, even though I have my opinion, is this multi-party system as chaotic, as crazy, as balaganistic as it sounds? Is it a more authentic representation of democracy? I believe so. Does it mean that it makes government more or less efficient? That's for you to answer. But I really do believe it is a much more, much more representative. There you can see our first cabinet. We had Golda around, there she is on the left-hand side. Can you see? I cannot describe. I can see my computer. Good. It's fascinating. Even the first Zionist Congress in 1897, women were not only allowed to be delegates, but were allowed to vote. When were women allowed to vote in Canada? I don't know the answer to this question, so any question Gloria would know. No, when were women allowed to vote in Canada? In America, I think it was 1918. So even before most Western democracies allowed women to vote, we could vote. And Golda was a member of the cabinet, eventually, of course, prime minister. And there is fascinating. The last time I was in the Knesset with a group, before COVID, that's my group with Yuli Edelstein, who was the speaker of the Knesset, who, to remind you, was to give you a sense of how far we've come on that kind of transition from Rabbanut to Ribonut. He was a famous prisoner of Zion in the Gulag who comes to, makes Aliyah, and eventually is the speaker of the Knesset. Parliamentary versus presidential, as I mentioned, one of the 14 basic laws establishes the Knesset as the lawmakers decided to be elected in, quote, general, national, direct, equal, secret, and proportional elections. So every party, as long as you are allowed, and you see who is allowed to have a party and to form a party, people vote based on a party list. It might say a list, the Likud party led by Benjamin Netanyahu, or it might say the Labour Party led by Merav Michaeli, but you vote for a party, forget all this stuff. But the difference, of course, between the presidential and the prime ministerial, like your system you're more familiar with, and that is that the cabinet secretaries, how does it work in Canada? Who appoints the cabinet secretaries? The prime minister. Are they members of the parliament? Do they have to be members of parliament? No. So in Israel, it's very similar. Most are members of parliament. They don't have to be members of parliament. And oftentimes they resign their parliamentary seat in order to allow somebody else to come in, and they sit around the cabinet table, whereas in the American system, the cabinet secretaries are appointed by the president, and they rule according to what the president wants. So the previous, without mentioning names, the previous American president twice a week would change his cabinet secretary, right? And people say that we've got an unstable government. Well, guess what? From November 2016 to November 2020, the same president ruled America. The government kept changing. Keep that in mind. And the powers are different, of course. So one national district, as I already mentioned. Which parties cannot run? Only those parties who are who fulfill the following, who basically fall into the following criterion. They don't think that Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish democratic state. And there are some who sometimes are questioned as to whether or not they uphold that belief, Arab parties in particular. Incitement to racism. There was one Jewish party that was outlawed recently. Recently 25, 30 years ago, Mayor Kahana's Kach party. His followers have a political party as well, and there's always this question as to whether or not his party is inciting toward racism or not, which is a subjective term that the courts, apropos what we read this morning, have to determine whether or not there's something wrong with that. Or support for armed struggle, terrorism against Israel. There have been members of Knesset, for example, of Arab parties who came into Israel on the Avi Marmara, you might remember this, from Turkey a while ago, to the flotilla from Turkey that was trying to bring humanitarian aid to Gaza. So there's some issues with that. And as you know, when you vote for mayor, how many candidates for mayor next week are coming? There are 5. Well, you have what, 1 million plus people in Vancouver? Fair enough, 5 candidates. Any guess how many parties run on average in the elections in Israel?
40?
Between 30 to 50. When I put this together, I don't remember what election this one was, whatever it was, but I think there are 19 different parties. Oh no, here are the 19 different Knesset, sorry. And you see the number of parties in the top, 32, 33, 31, pretty crazy. Last elections, we've had about 30 parties as well. Who gets into the Knesset, though? Only those people who get above a minimum threshold, which has changed over time. I'll come back to that in a minute. That's me. Don't take a picture of this because you can forge my identity then. Oh, no. This is what I get. I should get it when I get home in a couple of weeks' time. Piece of paper with my name. In Canada, do you have to register to vote? Yeah. You do have to register. How do you do that? Yeah. So if you don't drive, you can't vote?
No. Well, you have an identity card.
You have to have an identity card if you don't have an identity card? That's complicated. In Israel, you don't have to register.
You're required to register.
But if,
Wow.
in Israel, you don't need to register. When you're 16, when you're born, you get an ID number in Israel. When you're 16, you get your ID card. And the moment you're 18, you get this notice in the mail with your name. And you basically take this piece of paper with your ID card or your driver's license. You go to the ballot box. They take a little pen and they cross out your name. They give you a piece of paper. You go and you vote, and they give you your ID card back. There's no need for any voter registration. That's why I said earlier that even Israelis who aren't in Israel now, who don't live there but have an Israeli ID number, can actually vote and register. So, as I already mentioned all these details. And then what happens is the votes are counted in the very old-fashioned way. You go into the ballot box, you take this piece of paper, there are 30 or 40 down there, you put it into the envelope, and then at the end of the day, all the envelopes are counted. No hanging chads, no electronic stuff. It's all very, very straightforward, old-fashioned. You need to have 3.25% of the popular vote. So if we had, in the last election, I think 32, 35 parties running, there were 13 parties, each of which received at least 3.25% of the popular vote, and the other parties received less than that. Now, what happens if you receive 100,000 votes, less than the 3.25%, throwing out a number? What happens to your votes? They're thrown away, unless you sign an agreement with another party before the election of surplus votes. So you votes can go to the other party. But each head of the party, as I mentioned before, goes to the president then chooses who he or she believes is most capable of forming a government. They then have 42 days in order to create a government. It doesn't always work, and if it doesn't work, what happens? You go to new elections, or the candidate, and this happened in the last election. Netanyahu's Likud party received more votes than 30 votes, 30 seats, 25% of the popular vote. And the president turned to Netanyahu and said, try to form a government. He couldn't succeed. So he turned the mandate back to the president, who then said, turn to somebody else, Yair Lapid, who ended up forming a government. 2 elections ago, if I remember, don't correct me because it's too many elections, but 2 elections ago, Netanyahu did not return the opportunity to the president. Instead, he voted to dissolve the Knesset, which meant that they went to no elections. So there's all sorts of games happening. There's the ballot box. There's some of the crazy candidates from 20. And here, a little personal aspect of the story. That's me, my wife Michelle, and our middle child Adi voting proudly, thinking that finally we're going to have election results April 2019. And as you're going into the school classroom, you see, I don't know if you can make it out there, about 35 different letters on those pieces of paper in Hebrew and Arabic, telling you what the parties are led by whom. You go into the ballot box, you pick your piece of paper, and you put it in the ballot box. That was April 2019. And then fast forward, and there we are voting, right? Classroom. Michelle Albi's is a more dramatic one, but that's another story. And then, it's getting stuck. What's getting stuck? There we go. And then we had another election. Now, why did we have to go to another election? Because Netanyahu had been given the opportunity to form a government, but couldn't. And as I said, he went back and he dissolved the Knesset. Notice there are fewer numbers of parties here, a little bit less, not that few. There I'm voting. It's a warmer day. It was September, not exactly 3 years ago. And then we had more elections. It was a colder day. You could see it was the spring. It was probably 22 degrees, so Michelle wore a winter jacket. And there we were, happily voting, hoping that for the 3rd time lucky, we would eventually have a government. But guess what? Didn't quite work out that way. As I mentioned before, the 3rd big difference is that we don't have a winner-take-all system. You need a certain minimum percent. The highest percent, by the way, was Golda as prime minister on the coattails of the success of the Six-Day War in 1968. Her party, 69, so her party won a little bit shy of 50% of the popular vote, but that's it. And if you look at the elections, so election number 3 in March of 2020, what happened? We had 6 major parties that ultimately were 7 parties, I said, who passed the threshold, 3 of which clearly on the center left in red, although I don't know why the icon should be there, whatever, and 4 on the center right. But look what happened. The bloc of one on the right, Likud, had 36 seats. And together with the other parties who thought that Netanyahu should be prime minister, they formed 58. And Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid ran a joint party together, and they received 33 seats, a little bit less than Netanyahu's Likud party. And the parties that affiliated with them, but might not necessarily have even agreed to form a government with them, were less, 55 seats. So you need 61. What happened? There was one party in the middle, which had 7 seats, Yisrael Beitenu, which is our current finance minister, Avigdor Lieberman's party. And they, on the one hand, are politically right, in fact, right of Netanyahu on many issues, but they refuse to sit with Netanyahu. So what's happened, and I'll come to this a little bit later, is that politics in Israel has gone from voting for a party with an ideology to voting about who you're voting for or who you're voting against. Right? The classic question in the last 4 and in the current election is very Shakespearean, and that is, to Bibi or not to Bibi? That is the question. And once you decide, okay, I'm in favor of Bibi as the prime minister or not, then I'm going to vote for whatever party I think best represents me. And so on the center left, we had this man, Benny Gantz, currently our defense minister, who agreed to sit on a national emergency government in May of 2020 with Netanyahu because we had something called COVID. I think you experienced that here as well. We didn't have a budget. And he said, listen, I'll join your government, Mr. Netanyahu, but he paid a heavy price. His 33 seats of his party, half of them didn't join the government, led by Yair Lapid. So he had a split. So some of those, about 15 of the 33, went and joined Netanyahu. Then they had a government. And it was all, rosy. They had 73 out of 120 seats. Benny Gantz was the defense minister. And the agreement was that within a few months, there would be a budget passed, because we didn't have a budget. Guess what? End of December, that short-lived government ended because there was no budget passed. The Knesset dissolved automatically when there's no budget passed. And these two men who sat in government, and Gantz on the left in the picture and on the left politically, paid a very heavy price because he said, listen, although I ran on a ticket saying, if you elect me, I will not sit with the prime minister. He broke his promise. He broke his promise, he said, because of the state of emergency that the world faced, and Israel faced, of course, as well, not having a government in the midst of COVID. Difference number 4. Number 4, I've already said, Constitution. I already talked about this, so don't worry about that. But in 1992, that law, which was a value of Israel, but never enshrined in law, one of the basic laws added in the 1990s was was recognizing Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. However, and I mentioned this to Bima, in 2018, the Knesset passed a controversial law called the nation-state law, which essentially said that Jewish and democratic, we can no longer live in this tension. It's Jewish, more importantly, than it is democratic. That's something that we still argue with. No fixed election date, as I said, it's a holiday, and forget all this stuff. So, very important, it is a holiday. And if you do have to work, you're actually paid time and a half, which is fascinating. And kids kind of love it because their schools are used as polling stations, so they have to go abroad. So you think of the cost, it's about 4 to 5 billion shekels, so it's about 2 billion Canadian dollars. That will mean by November 1st, we'll spend 10 billion Canadian dollars in 5 elections in 3.5 years to try to figure out who should fulfill Parshat Shoftim. Who funds it, as I already mentioned before, funded mostly by our taxpayers. I mentioned no absentee voting ballots. Our youngest son, who voted, I think it's a record, he voted 3 times in uniform in his 4-year service. Pretty crazy. He's not going to be able to vote because he's going on his post-army trip to Africa on October 30th. I said, you don't want to change it? He says, Nira lacha, you think? So he's not planning on changing. High voter turnout, I've already mentioned it. It's fallen a little bit. What else? We always have coalition governments. I talked about that before. Head of government, head of state. And this is, to me, the most important piece. In a winner-take-all system, like in the American system, as flawed and as scarred as it is, whoever gets more votes, and France has a lot of democracies have presidential as well as prime ministers. It's a bit flawed in America because, think of the numbers, and I put this together. It reminded Ross Perot, many of us remember, who ran in the early 90s. He got 18.9% of the popular vote. Now, Netanyahu, to put it in perspective, got 30 seats in the last, that's 25% of the popular vote. So people are critical of how can a guy like Naftali Bennett, who has 6 seats, 5% of the popular vote his party gets, become prime minister, versus in America, 1 of every 5 people who voted in the federal elections in America had no representation. Right? They voted for the losing squad, and they were left out. You need to have at least 3.25% of the popular vote. It used to be 2.5%. And about 15 years ago, the political right changed the law out of the hope, at least the initiator of the law, hoped that the 4 small Arab parties would all fall below the 3.25% threshold. What happened was, bizarrely, the 4 Arab parties, and this goes back to what I said, the attention of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, the 4 Arab parties joined together to a joint Arab list. It's hard to imagine, but there's only one country in the world where an Islamist and a communist party and 2 other parties, Arabs, joined together in a joint list. But that's one of the beauties of Jewish majority democratic country called Israel. So, is it a more authentic representation of the citizenship and the tribes, groups within society? Absolutely. As I mentioned, I think nothing short of miraculous, the fact that we've succeeded in bringing people from very diverse backgrounds. And think, 1 of every 5 Israelis who vote are from the former Soviet Union. A member, the finance minister, right, Victor Lieberman, is from the former Soviet Union. He's been there in Israel for 50 years, but a huge, remarkable challenge. What are the challenges in recent years? And I'm almost at the point where I turn it over to questions. There has been a drop from almost 90% in our first elections to about 70% in the last elections. There is voter fatigue, much as you would not be surprised by it. The second biggest change has been the moving away from the 2 big parties to multiple smaller parties. So most of you are of the generation where you remember that there was either Likud or Labor in government, and one would get 40 or 45 seats and the other would get 30 or 35 seats. And between those 2 parties, the left of center Labor, and whatever alignment or avodah, whatever it was, and the right of center Likud would together have 80 seats. That's 2 out of every 3 voters would vote for one of those 2 big parties, Ben-Gurion, Begin, whatever. What's happened now? In the last elections, think about it. The Labour Party has 7 seats. The Likud Party has 30 seats. So the traditional way, and that's why I say take your glasses off, of seeing Israeli politics is incorrect. 37, 1 out of 3 voters, less than 1 out of 3 voters vote for those 2 classic Israeli parties. It's kind of like, I grew up in Vancouver, as you know, the Liberals and the Conservatives in British Columbia had something called the Social Democratic Party, if they're still alive, and the NDP. But, mostly across Canada, it's probably about 80% of Canada probably still votes for the Tories and the Liberals, right? And the Green Party sometimes and Bloc Québécois move in. But in Israel, we've gone in the past 25 years from 2/3 voting for the 2 major parties to the vast majority voting for much smaller parties, which I think is a big thing. And the largest party oftentimes has made up, in recent years, less than half of the coalition. So if you're a prime minister and you need 61, a minimum majority, to govern in the parliament, and you only have 30 seats, and you let's have 65 in your government, there are more people in your government who are not from your party, which means that they oftentimes have to pay a very heavy political price to bring them in and to ensure their continued staying inside of your government. The second piece, and the consequence, I think, of not, and maybe or the other way around, but the fact that 2/3 of people don't vote for the major parties anymore, as used to, has to do with the fact that the major internal issue, the divided Israelis, along which they would vote in elections, was what to do with Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. Right? Do you hold on to it? Do you give it up? Land for peace, peace for land? Huge question. Today, there is nobody, almost, in Israeli society going to vote on November 1st who's voting along that issue. They're voting on a lot of other issues, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. The first and foremost is their tribal or their sub-identity within Israeli society. The other issue is economics, the high cost of living in Israel, the growing high cost of Israel. And there's also become, a la perhaps American democracy, a personalization of politics. So years ago, when I moved to Israel in the late 80s, early 90s, I'd vote for a party, I still do actually, that I identify with ideologically, the ideology, the worldview of that party. More and more Israelis, including my voting age adult kids in their 20s, vote for people rather than for a political party, which is fascinating because most people-based parties, kind of center parties, think of Dash under Yigal Yadin in the mid-1970s, right? Think of Tomi Lapid, the father of our prime minister, his Senior Citizens Party. They got 15 seats. right? Huge. Now his middle of the road party, the Shinui party got 15 seats. They last an election, they disappear. Another party comes around, some charismatic leader. But the parties with real staying power were these left and right, Labour and Likud. But they are much smaller today. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of personalization around that key question of to Bibi or not to Bibi. We had a fourth election. I don't want to bore you too much because we've still got one more coming up in March of 2021. And that was fascinating. This, I took a picture in the box. How many are there? And there are 20, almost 30 letters, 30 different parties. We had 13 parties who passed the threshold. Of those, we had something absolutely unprecedented. Here's some of the election campaigns. I went for a bike ride, voting for, do you recognize the gentleman on the left? He's one of the most important figures in Israeli politics. He's been dead for about 15 years now. Ovadia Yosef. He is the former Sephardic chief rabbi, kind of the ideological mentor of the Shas party, very important political player. Meretz, the party with Green, the left of center party, Emet, the Labour Party, Likud on the right-hand side. I'm surprised actually, given where I live in Middle Israel, that there would actually be a Shas sign up there, but somebody put it up probably in the middle of the night. And then you can see to the right, you can see on the right Naftali Bennett, right, on the political right, and Gideon Sar on the political right, and then in the left, this is actually lined perfectly. In the middle over there is our current Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, kind of the centrist party, and on the left was the Meretz party. But what happens after the elections? Once again, inconclusive results, in spite of the fact that in the midst of this campaign and all the other campaigns, there are actually 4, and now there are only 3, investigations on the Prime Minister, and 3 of them he was actually in court dealing with them, and there were protests outside of his house. The corrupt one, what does he say? You know, he's taking from the Passover Seder, the Rashama, the corrupt one, what does he say? Remember our Parsha, the opening line, make sure that our judges and our justices are not corrupt. What are these laws for you and not for him? The diametric opposite, I would argue, and maybe I'm putting out my political colors out there, but I would argue from what many of our politicians in many Western countries, how about that? I protect myself a little bit better, would be saying. But in spite of these 3 investigations, in spite of these 3 court cases, guess what? Israelis believe that protests work. Look at this. From the Israel Democracy Institute, 75%, no more, but 70% of Israelis believe in the power of political protest, which is great. You, on the one hand, might say Israelis are apathetic. They're in their 4th election campaign right a year ago. Nobody's going to want to vote, but yet they're still protesting, and they believe in the fact that those protests can actually affect political change. So there we were. This time, I don't know why we had 8, but we had 8. I don't know what it was. My daughter-in-law. Yeah, my daughter-in-law had her address at our house as well. There were 8 ballots that were sent to our house. Of course, you could only use the one with your name on them. That was a soldier voting. There are very few countries in the world where the soldiers are voting on their bases. The Knesset was empty just for a few weeks until the results came in. Netanyahu tried but failed to form a government. And then the president turned it over to this man in the center, this man on the left, and this man on the right, to try to form a government, and they did. In June of last year, they formed an unprecedented government with 8 political parties, from the left to the right. There he is, our former Prime Minister, I guess I could say this, Naftali Bennett on the left, they should be switched, and our current Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, on the right-hand side. What is often referred to as the 70-30 club. What are we talking about? What's 70-30? So 3 parties to the left, an Arrow party, Meretz party, the Labour Party, 3 parties to the right, 2 parties in the center, formed a government. What's the 70-30? The Prime Minister said, listen, there's 70% of the issues that we agree with. Passing a budget, first and foremost, right? Making sure Israel is here, making sure we deal with COVID, and there are 30% of the issues that we disagree with. Settle the West Bank, or abandon the West Bank, settle Judea and Samaria. So let's talk about what we can agree on. Very, very fragile government, 61 out of 120 seats. It lasted for about a year until there were a couple defectors. Forget all the numbers here, but you can see 13 parties passed the election threshold. Oh, this was important because what percentage? You can see 67.44% of Israelis voted, down about 4%. So there is a bit of fatigue, and there's a lot of concern, particularly in the center and left in Israel, that voter fatigue will continue in the next election. There was Bennett, there was the cabinet. I mean, not quite like your Canadian cabinet, 50% women, but very, very close. To put it in context to some political parties that have no women, the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties have no women candidates for Knesset. The Likud party had their primaries last week, 2 weeks ago. 4 of the 30 first members in the seat are women. So definitely the political right in Israel is less women representation, tragically. Our president, Bougie Herzog, that was his residence. And there we were, and it's funny, I put this together a number of months ago, but I thought of today's parsha, and I realized there is, who on the left-hand side? Moshe Rabbeinu, telling us what we read today. And who was that on the right-hand side? David HaMelech, right? The second king, who we eventually chose to appoint. Where? In the empty Knesset, waiting for the Knesset to sit. There is Lapid, our prime minister. I guess you would call him the acting or the temporary, the interim prime minister. A lot of people are saying, oh, he finally got what he wanted. He wanted to be prime minister. He was prime minister for 4 months. But he could be prime minister for longer. Because what happens if our election results are inconclusive on November 1st? Someone will be given 6 weeks to form a government. Now, if they don't form it, somebody else can be given. I think it's only 3 weeks after that. And if not, we go to new elections. And who is in power until those new elections? Netanyahu was in power for 3 years, even though he wasn't elected after those elections. Where are we today in the polls? Is the latest poll that I had. You might have seen this on the Times of Israel. Netanyahu's party, Likud, 33 seats, which is about 10% more than he has now. Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, is up significantly, maybe because he is prime minister, maybe because he had led a very successful and thankfully short campaign in Gaza for less than 3 days a couple of months ago. The Blue and White Party joined with another party on the political right. Now they've got 13 seats. So in many ways, if you ask me, you should take the seats of the Likud, 33, and together, and then compare that to the Yesh Atid and Blue and White, who used to be part of one party, and they're about 36. But then you've got all these other parties. Once again, 8 or 9 parties passing the threshold. 2 that I think are very interesting. One, the Blue and White New Hope, which is made up of our Defense Minister Benny Gantz and our Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar on the political right, and they're quite far apart. But yet they both agree not to work with Netanyahu. And then the party with 6.7 seats, Otzma Yehudit, you can see, and then off to the right, religious Zionism, and I mean to the right, with 5 seats. Those 2 parties, the religious Zionism is kind of the heir to the National Religious Party, but Otzma Yehudit is the heir to Kahana, Meir Kahana, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, tragically, for many Israelis, I believe, that about 13 of the seats in the Knesset, over 10%, are going to go to far-right parties, who are largely sitting there because of Netanyahu's support of them. And just last weekend, they came, the leaders of those 2 parties came because the prime minister wanted to put them together out of the belief that if they ran separately, one might not pass the threshold, and that they might only have 8 or 10 seats in the separatists, but they ran together, they could have 12 or 15 seats. So something to watch out for in the upcoming elections. And with that, I think I draw to a conclusion. And I turn it over to you to ask any questions. So before the questions. One is the question, Bibi or not the Bibi? Think of the 11 differences between our system and most other systems. Think of what you used to think of as the Israeli system, how it worked, and how different it is. And think, as I said in the sanctuary beforehand, how it seems absolutely chaotic, but yet you've got more voices sitting around a cabinet table, and in diverse voices, I should say, than any other Western country that I can think of, from the far left to the far right. Questions, Mrs. Laffer?
The Israeli Arabs that vote, what percent of them vote?
So what percentage of Israeli Arabs? 1 out of every 5 Israelis are Arabs. What percentage vote? About 40%, which is less than the 70% nationally. And there's a lot of concern that they're not going to vote, which is good for the political right, but bad for the political left. I should mention that one party over here, the second one on the right, Ram, you see it, with 4.3 seats, is perhaps the greatest success, and I should add to this here, Dan, the greatest success of Israeli democracy. The leader of an Arab party, Mansour Abbas, a Muslim dentist, lives up in the Galilee, and Mansour Abbas, after the election in 2 elections ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu approached him and said, 2021, and said, I'd like to talk about you joining our government publicly. And then Netanyahu was not able to form a government. Mansour Abbas, they couldn't come to an agreement. And then when the other side was given the opportunity to form a government and they invited Mansour Abbas, there's never been an Arab party. There have been Arab members of the bigger parties, but there's never been an Arab party that was part of the governing coalition. And Mansour Abbas was invited by Bennett and Lapid to join them, and he was one of those people. Here he is on the right there. He's the guy on the right, although he's actually on the left, but politically. But that's Mansour Abbas, and Mansour Abbas joined the Knesset. He's publicly joined the government. He's publicly said a number of times that he sees himself as a citizen of Israel. He's an Arab. He's a Muslim, and that he wants to fight for whatever he thinks his community, the 20% of Israelis who aren't Jewish, need in Israeli society, but he has no aspirations to change the Jewish nature of the state of Israel, which is a watershed moment in Israeli democracy. I was with the URJ leadership in June when they came to Israel, the board, and we went to Knesset, and we met with a number of members of Knesset. He got the longest standing ovation from anybody, because in many ways, the fact that he's part of the government, as I said earlier, is a phenomenal expression of how far we have come from Rabbanut, from Rabbanut to Ribonut, from us being able to govern ourselves with all the tensions, and even if it only lasted for a year, nothing short, I think, of miraculous, the fact that there was a government that, included an Arab party and parties far to the right. Why? Because, as Bennett said, they agreed on the 70%, and I'll talk about the 70% issue. So Arab voters vote in smaller numbers. Abbas had a falling out with the other party. There used to be an Arab list together, so there's an Arab list, which essentially fights more for Palestinian national issues rather than for issues of Israeli as Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. So there are a lower percentage of voter turnout. The highest percentage, what tribe in Israel would you say votes more than anyone else? Specifically, not just the religious tomorrow, but the ultra-Orthodox. The rabbi tells them, just like Temple Shalom, I understand, the rabbi says, vote, here's who you're going to vote for. Fundamentally different. 5 candidates come here. What's that?
How do you know that last remark?
Which one? Do they vote often?
No, about our rabbi.
Oh, I'm assuming. Maybe I should not assume. But he's invited 5 candidates, not 1 candidate. But how do you know in Israel? So neighborhoods in Israel are, of course, very defined. So there are ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem, Bnei Brak, etc. And you look afterwards and you see the voting turnout is much higher in those neighborhoods, 1, and 2, the voting turnout, they vote largely for the same party in that neighborhood. Soldiers vote, they're all over the place. Both of my, when my boys, I don't think my daughter voted in the 2 years she was in the army, but my boys, the first one voted, but my younger one a lot. And I said, do you guys talk about it? He says, yeah, we talk about it as friends, but we're brothers in arms, we talk about it. And where do they vote? All over the place. So we get, far right and far left. And I think maybe that's what makes Israelis, able to turn out, because they realize that there's a lot, they have skin in the game, obviously, 1, 2, but there's a significant, they really feel the impact of their voting, and they really feel that their voice, or the voice of their opinion of their tribe, has a place to be expressed, not only in the parliament, but in the government as well. Yes, I don't know your name. But yes? Simon.
What's been the role of the diaspora in these last few elections, especially coming into this next election?
What has been the role of the diaspora in the coming elections? Unfortunately, Simon, as we said at lunch, not much. There are some Israelis, yours truly included, who really feel there's a connection and a responsibility. But the best example I can say to that is that maybe 8 or 10 years ago, correct me on this, Dan, the Prime Minister Netanyahu made an agreement to create an egalitarian space at the Kotel. And it was largely because of requests from Jews in the diaspora, particularly the leadership of the Reform and Conservative movement in North America. And he made a commitment that he was going to take the traditional separated men and women section of the Kotel, take this egalitarian Ezrat Yisrael section that was created about 10 years ago when Naftali Bennett was the housing minister, and redo the entire place and kind of create legitimacy to the non-ultra-Orthodox space at the Western Wall. And then he decided that he was going to renege on his promise because he was worried that the ultra-Orthodox parties in his government would leave his government. So maybe that's only one story, but I think most Israeli leaders, on the one hand, feel a responsibility to world Jewry, but it's a responsibility that I personally believe is how they see it. So it's a responsibility to take care of you if you're stuck in Entebbe in 1976. It's a responsibility if you're being kidnapped by terrorists in Munich in 1972. But you can continue to visit us and continue to contribute to us, but we're not necessarily going to listen to what you think we should be doing in our politics. And the truth of the matter is, none of you, to my knowledge, I mean, some of you are citizens, but you don't live there, you don't pay taxes there, and your kids go to the army there. So should Jews all over the world have a say in what happens in Israel? Yeah. But does that, and an influence? Yeah. But a vote, and there's a big difference. So there was a period in the late 90s, early O's, where Barak on the left and Netanyahu on the right went abroad and raised money for these temporary, these kind of super PACs when they were electing for prime minister, and these not-for-profits that weren't really to elect them, but we all know were to elect them. That you don't hear of anymore, unfortunately. So tragically, that's all right.
What effect is the potential trial of?
Oh, good question. What of Netanyahu? What is the effect of Netanyahu's trial? So there are three cases, I didn't talk about, three cases which have to do with our parsha. Corruption, bribery, whatever else, influence. One has to do with a good friend of his who owned a website called Walla, who also owned a cell phone company, or a phone company called Bezek, and the prime minister was the minister of communication at the time, and allowed a merging of those companies, so the debt in one company would be wiped out by the profits in the other. Interesting. Another is allegations of excessive in the hundreds of thousands of dollars of gifts given from people abroad, including the famous Hollywood producer Arnold Milchan, who apparently, who knows, asked the prime minister to intercede on his behalf to get him an American citizenship or an extension of his visa, because he's an Israeli living in Hollywood. And the third one had to do with the publisher of Yediot Achronot, the biggest selling daily newspaper in Israel, who was critical of the prime minister. That's what happens in democracies. And he, at the same time, there still is a free newspaper that was totally funded by the Adelson family, a big supporter of Netanyahu. And there was unfavorable coverage in one paper, and Netanyahu allegedly spoke with the publisher of Yediot Achronot and said, listen, if you are less critical of me, then I will pass a law, for example, that will limit the ability to publish a free newspaper, which is Adelson. So they're all under investigation. He's innocent until proven guilty. I'll give you one short personal anecdote. I just finished guiding a group, conservative synagogue from New Jersey, and my bus driver, Yaakov, 10th generation Jerusalemite, says to me, so, what's going to happen in the election? He said, Bibi, 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 Bibi. I said, just Bibi, only Bibi. I said, what do you mean only Bibi? I said, what are the issues? Doesn't matter what the issues are. Bibi, 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 Bibi. So I believe 25 plus or minus percent of Israelis will always vote for Bibi. Nothing you can do about it. Whether he's been in power for too long or not enough time, he's the only one who about a quarter of Israelis think will protect us from the Iranian threat, will protect us from COVID, right? Will negotiate with Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, to get Israel to be the guinea pig of the entire world for vaccinations. And the other 75% of Israelis don't have a strong leader that they can cling to. And I think that's one of the challenges of Israeli democracy. Netanyahu was polled, as in each of the four elections, got about 25, 27% of the vote, but has struggled to form a government. I'm not sure he will be able to form a government after the current election. His numbers aren't going up by a huge amount, but they're not dropping either. So there's that percentage of people who are, to Bibi or not to Bibi, there's no question. By the way, the issue of Iran, which is big in the news, every time I go abroad, people say, what's with Iran, what's with Iran? There was just an interview with 5 of the 7 living former commanders-in-chief of Tzahal, and all of them said that not only we, but the majority of leaders, former heads of the Mossad and the GSS, the Shabak in Israel, FBI equivalents in Israel, all believe that internal schisms in Israel are greater threats to our future than the Iran nuclear threat, which is fascinating. So maybe that explains why Israelis aren't voting left and right, Labor and Likud anymore, but are voting for more internal, particularistic tribal issues within society.
Mike, thank you so much. Really. Just a reminder that Mike will be back on Wednesday at lunchtime at noon here at the synagogue. Bring your own lunch for another learning opportunity. We are planning an Israel trip this summer for the congregation. End of July, coming summer, end of July, beginning of August. Rabbi Brown's leading that trip. It's a family Israel trip. And there is also plans for a cross-Canada Federation trip for Israel's 75th anniversary, and I'm supposed to get details about that in the coming days from our Jewish Federation to be able to share that with all of you. So opportunities to go to Israel. Thank you so much for being here, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Sorry?
So Dan, I don't know if Dan, I'm from Windsor. I'll use this spell.
So did you-